go. Well, hello everybody, I'm Thomas, and thank you Alexander for teeing me up because I'm going to talk about cycling in Manchester. So that's exactly the topic of my presentation. So I'm going to link my research, which is on cycling infrastructure in Manchester, Mexico City, and Toronto, with this kind of topic of justice and the different kind of scales of justice. So I think you also kind of introduced that topic a bit, kind of between the global and the local, the kind of different mediations between those cases. So yeah, it's these three cities, not kind of your typical cycling cities, but have a lot of policies and projects in place to shift the needle. So they're really kind of trying to become cycling cities, trying to improve the conditions, and it's very much part of the climate plans in these cities. Now, I've done my fieldwork in Toronto and Mexico City. I'm only just starting in Manchester, so the parts about Manchester are a bit more based on policy documents and kind of my personal experiences, but not so much yet on the interviews, which is my main research method. So as you're well aware, cycling has for a very long time been marginalized in traditional transport planning in the middle part of the 20th century, but it's now coming up again as a kind of a best practice for city governments around the world. Multiple crises it responds to, so it's not only a climate strategy, and I'd say actually the climate impact is sometimes exaggerated. I think other things are much more commendable about it. But there is this tension between the global and the local in these projects, because you have this kind of global ideas of what a cycling city should look like, what kinds of impacts can be gained from promoting cycling, what kinds of infrastructures are necessary, but then it has to be translated to local models and local practices like Manchester's policies. And you might be able to see this as a kind of a process of convergence. Cities are starting to look more like each other, but actually when you look into the details, there's also a lot of differences happening, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So yeah, the example of the Be Active network here in Manchester. So we want some world-class walking and cycling infrastructure. It's going to be fully joined up, the first city region. Of course, London is kind of the example, but London's not a city region. So we're going to get all these great cycling infrastructures, and actually, just a few days ago, Manchester was named next year's European capital of cycling, so I'm very interested to see what's going to happen. So a lot of things going on in Manchester. I'm going to link it to kind of this discourse around transportation equity. We're talking about just transitions today. And actually, there's been a lot of academic work coming out, which is really kind of problematizing the equity impacts of cycling and cycling infrastructures. So cycling is not inherently emancipatory, it's not inherently progressive. There's actually a lot of problems with it in terms of how it's driven by capitalist urbanization. So there's a lot of links between cycling infrastructure and gentrification, particularly in US cities. Kind of the focus on making people move more efficiently, kind of to lubricate the mobility. A lot of work coming out of London in particular, where kind of cycling is seen as this thing for the financial workers in the city. And in particular, you have this discourse on the kind of the topographies of provision. So where are these cycling improvements happening, and who are the people that can benefit from those? So a good example is Mexico City. So in 2010, Mexico City started implementing cycling policies and projects, particularly the Eco-BC bike share system, the largest in Latin America, was implemented in the city center. You can see there the purple zone. But the highest cycling rates were actually in the southeast of the city, in the much poorer periphery, because cycling is actually a kind of the vehicle of the poor. But the objective was to shift that image and start getting middle classes and professionals on bikes. So it was very much targeted not for the poor, but for kind of the better off in Mexico City. So as of 2018, before the current government entered, you had this cycling network in the center of the city, and as you can see, it's only addressing a part of the transportation demand by bike, whereas the southeastern periphery area, it's a lot of cycling going on, but there was no cycling infrastructure put in there. So here you can kind of see the map. So basically, this green area here on the right-hand side is where the best access to jobs is, and that's exactly where they put in the bike share system. So bike share for the rich. Informal motorcycle taxis, also called Eco-BC, more kind of a joke on the periphery. And so this kind of links to this wider discourse on transportation justice or transportation equity, transportation poverty, which has been coming up, which kind of quantifies these dimensions a lot, and you can kind of start to see with this table here all the different things that you can take into account. There's all kinds of different metrics and groups you can analyze, and there's really not one single indicator of equity, so it becomes quite difficult to actually establish what is transportation equity, even with these very quantitative and kind of hard science approaches, I guess you could call them. And in Toronto, we can see this happening. So in Toronto, you have this unequal distribution of cycling. A lot the cycling that happens in Toronto is very concentrated in the city centre, whereas the outer, the suburb areas, I guess, have much lower cycling rates. And this overlaps quite well with the equity analysis that they've been doing now. So again, we have all these different categories. I think it's 17 different groups in 7 categories, and that kind of reflects these transportation equity opportunity zones. And again, they're kind of the opposite of where the cycling is taking place. So the areas where there's little cycling is also where there's more equity needs. And you can kind of compare that to where the cycling infrastructures are. So again, cycling infrastructure is concentrated in the city centre. There's a few bike lanes in the outskirts, but they're not connected at all. And that's the case in Toronto. So what's going on in Manchester? Well, again, we see kind of a similar dynamic. Where are the cycling infrastructures? They're concentrated in the city centre. So the Barrow bike share system, maybe someone's tried it here. It's a very limited zone. You can't go far outside the city centre on the Barrow bikes. And also a lot of the best cycling infrastructure in Manchester, so the Oxford Road Cycleway just outside here. Again, it's in a very specific part of the city. You may be able to say, well, it's also kind of very problematic that it's concentrated in the city centre. But the thing is, in Manchester, where are the deprived neighbourhoods? They're actually in the centre, they're not in the suburbs. So this is a 2010 map where they put in these cycle hubs. And you can see they kind of overlap with the most deprived areas. So the red would be the more deprived areas of Manchester. So perhaps they are getting things right in terms of equity, are they? Of course, not every deprived neighbourhood in Manchester is the same. Some deprived neighbourhoods are gentrifying. Some deprived neighbourhoods are changing. So you can see here the red neighbourhoods is actually where there's kind of a social uplift, and green is where things are getting worse. So actually, it's not as easy as just saying, well, put the cycling infrastructures in the deprived neighbourhoods, because there's actually differences between those as well. Another thing you could criticize about Manchester's approach is that they had this very kind of commuter-centric, get the lines into the city centre, so again, kind of the feed in the workers into the city centre, rather than improve mobilities in neighbourhoods. But the approach nowadays is actually very spread out over the greater Manchester area, so there's improvements, these B network improvements are happening all over the place, and actually the vision for the future network is this kind of, it will cover the whole of greater Manchester, and we'll kind of all have, we'll all be benefiting from these world-class cycling routes. So the vision is very inclusive. But do these inclusive visions, giving everybody the same provisions, does that actually address equity? So in my research, I've been kind of focusing on the differences between places even within the city. So infrastructures do not work the same in every place. So you can apply these kind of standard solutions, but then every place where you put them in is different. So standard solutions will have different impacts in different places. And one way to think about that is these different cyclescapes. So personally, I'm from the Netherlands. Something that works in the Netherlands, you put it in Mexico City, it's going to work very differently. It's a different cyclescape. So yeah, these impacts vary geographically, and there's not only differences between cities, but also within cities. So I'd like to show you some examples of that. And Mexico City is a great place because there's actually some discourse with the policymakers. It's actually one of the main people in charge in the Mobility Secretariat who wrote a book about this called Socialism Doesn't Arrive by Bike. And he said, well, the city streets are so heterogeneous, we cannot have one single model of mobility changes. And so you have this complete street idea. This is kind of the flagship bike lane. They put in with COVID, it's a great bike lane. But then what happens when you put bike lanes in the periphery, which is what this government has done. For the first time, they've actually put bike lanes in the southeastern part of the city, the part that was with the highest cycling rates, with relatively poor part of the city. And you get the same bike lanes, but very different users, right? So suddenly you'll have Also people riding the wrong way because it's two directions, don't really follow the directions of the road. You'll get horses, you'll get like these carts. You have a very well-ordered street in the center, you put the same bike lane in the periphery and it just becomes a bit of a chaos. Or gentrification, so you've got these new apartments being sold in the central areas. Well, you put the same bike lane next to an informal settlement and it becomes kind of the front yard. So you have these very different impacts of, even if it's kind of very similar designs, very different impacts according to the places where you put in the infrastructure. So the same thing's happening in Toronto as well. And Toronto is addressing equity. So to commend them, they're actually looking to address these equity opportunity zones. And as you can see here, there's neighborhood improvement areas out in the suburbs, kind of where the cycling infrastructures are concentrated in the center, and the neighborhood improvement areas are more on the outskirts. But you can already see they have these overlays, context 1, context 2. So that's kind of how this looks. So what does that mean, this context 1 and context 2? Is, well, they recognize that the city center is very different from the outskirts, right? So on this street, it's a transit priority corridor now. You're not allowed, you can drive, but only to access your destinations. You can't drive through it. You don't even need a bike lane, right? Just kind of lower the car traffic, and the street's pretty good for cycling already. And this place, they put in a bike lane. This is actually a bike lane, and it's just a mess, right? So there's no way you're actually going to get a lot of people cycling with these kinds of infrastructures. So different places, different solutions. You can put in the same thing, it's going to have a different impact, right? Just going to skip over that. So Manchester also is recognizing this. You can find this in some of these policy documents I've been looking at. So this kind of recognition that not every place in Manchester is going to have the same ability to actually promote cycling. So Manchester City Centre, Stockport, Trafford, that's kind of these places where it's going to work. Maybe the outer boroughs, the city centres as well, but certainly the areas between are kind of low opportunity areas. Here's analysis of short car trips. So these kinds of analyses of where could the highest impact be gained. So again, kind of distinguishing the different characteristics of space within one city. But the approach is kind of everybody gets infrastructure. So it's very, from what I've seen so far, and again, I haven't done my interviews with policymakers yet, only just starting, they kind of spread out the interventions. So basically every borough is getting an active neighborhood, which is like an LTN, a low traffic neighborhood. Every borough gets a top class cycling lane. Every borough gets a cyclops, which are these junctions you may have been seeing popping up. So basically every council in Manchester is getting one of these at least. And so they're kind of just being spread out irrespective of the differences between the places. So finally, to close off, I propose we can kind of move from this equity problematization to thinking of more of kind of how can cycling infrastructures actually emancipate and transform the ways transportation works. So rather than this transportation equity framing, this kind of idea of mobility justice, you could just quickly read that quote perhaps. I find it quite illustrative of the thinking behind mobility justice, where it really goes beyond spreading out the benefits and more kind of transforming the society. So you can kind of ask these questions whether cycling infrastructures really will have these impacts. And I'd say it really depends on the particular places and the processes that they operate within. So on the outskirts of Mexico City, you put in the bike lanes, and yes, they can have really socially just impacts, great impacts, but at the same time, the transportation department has been putting in directions on the streets. They always used to be two-way, now they're one-way. So as part of putting in kind of the same process of putting in the bike lanes, we've also been rationalizing the use of streets, which is actually favoring cars, and it's bad for cyclists because they're used to using the roads in both directions. It just gets you places quicker, and now they'll be cycling illegally. This man is going the right way, but a lot of people go the other way. Another process of formalization that's going on, so we've got all these informal neighborhoods, and there's a housing deficit in Mexico, and they've started building these formal neighborhoods on the outskirts. Is this improvement? I think it's very doubtful. Toronto, also doing things with housing. So the famous Yellow Belt of Toronto, massive housing crisis in Toronto. It's a really expensive place to buy a house. And one of the big reasons is that you can only build single family detached with massive lawns. And they're changing that. So now this Yellow Belt, all of these single family home neighborhoods are going to have multiplexes. What the impact's going to be on cycling, whether that can kind of have a synergy, we're not sure yet. They're also building transit. You can see this lovely bike lane. They can kind of benefit each other, but the impacts aren't always as hoped. So this is kind of what that bike lane looks like in practice. I don't know how many of you would want to cycle there, but I definitely didn't feel very protected. They're also building this massive spa, or they want to build it. There's actually quite a lot of resistance, and the new mayor is opposed. Yet, who knows another city that's building a massive spa from the firm group? Oh, that's right, yeah, Manchester. So yeah, this is Net Zero Manchester. We're building this massive glass dome. We're going to heat with gas year-round. Lovely. A lot of transportation projects going on as well. So cycling is part of a much bigger transformation of transportation in Manchester. And I'm not going to go through all these changes, but just show you an example here. This is a new road that's going to be built in Wigan. So yeah, basically a new motorway link. And I'm not necessarily against new roads, particularly because you could get the traffic off the high street that goes straight to the neighborhood. And you might be able to see this big junction there, which is called the Saddle Junction. It's actually a major cycling link. Like, if you want to improve cycling in Wigan, you have to do something about the green connection here. And they've actually done something. And you would say, well, if you're going to build this ring road, you could kind of take the traffic off there. But the intervention at the Saddle Junction has just been putting in these bike lanes and not really changing anything about the junction at all. So it's just kind of, don't want to say greenwashing, but basically green paint and a massive motorway junction and going together. So yeah, wider processes and specific places. Just to recap, it's not just about equity, it's about emancipation. Rather than the distribution of entities, it's a question of the relations that these infrastructures actually change or go into. Wider processes of urbanization, driven by capital generally. How are those impacting the transitions that are going on? And to speak back to what Alexander was mentioning about kind of local knowledges and global concepts, I really think that if we want to achieve these just transitions, we need particular case-specific knowledges of transition. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thomas,
questions?
Question. I've got
in the back.
Lady in the back. Yeah.
You made a really good point in terms of how cycle lanes are quite often used not just in Manchester but some in the whole of the UK, where we tend to congregate them to the inner city and it's all about work. Do you, in your research, do you raise that question to people about, have you asked what people would like it for, and do you ask individuals what they would like to see cycling lanes for? Like in the Netherlands, for example, you want to get your hair cut, you would take your bike. But I never see that question being asked. I live in Manchester, and nobody ever asked me, what would you like a cycle lane for? So
Yeah.
do you raise that in your research?
Well, so I'm studying policymakers. I'm not doing a research of users so much. Of course, part of my research is actually going and riding the bike lanes. In Toronto, Mexico City, I rode the vast majority of the network. So there is that kind of figuring out how they function. I'm not asking people so much as what they would like to see. I do speak to some activists, people that are more kind of recognized in their role there. But the question is very much, what do policymakers think that the bike lanes are actually going to achieve? And where should they go, like on which streets, in which areas, what kinds of connections? And I will say, if you go to the hairdresser in the Netherlands by bike, there's a very good chance you never use a bike lane. So actually, one of the massive successes of Dutch transport planning is it's not just about the bike lanes. It's about the circulation of cars in the whole city. So there's a circulation plan for the entire city, and then the bike lanes come in, where they have to be. right? So where there's going to be a lot of cars, that's where you put the bike lanes. But preferably, the streets are not going to have a lot of cars. So here, I mean, I think one of the good things Manchester is doing compared to Mexico City and Toronto are these active neighborhoods, these low traffic neighborhoods. London's got a lot of those as well. Of course, they're also very controversial, particularly because the traffic gets shifted onto the main roads. But then those are the roads where you can put the bike lane in. It's just that in, I think, UK cities, the problem is that often those roads are also the high streets. There's houses on those roads, lack of space, so the urbanization, the urban form is often very difficult to actually make that happen. But yeah, I would say it's not only bike lanes, basically.
Can I just come back on that point, just a quick one?
Very, very quick.
Okay. It's just, you can ask the policymakers, do they consult with the stakeholders? So you can still be the policymaker, you can still be asking the policymakers, but do they ask those questions?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the consultation processes are part of my research. Yeah, so like based on what knowledge is, how do you make the decisions? Yeah. But often there's kind of these general ideas of you know, the best practice from London or the best practice from the Netherlands, get some consultants from over here or get some consultants from over there. I think it's always very difficult to identify why a certain thing, like who made the decision, because there's all these different factors that come together. It's a very complex field, and I mean, personally, I don't think the solution is just let the local people decide everything. Like, there has to be some kind of balance there, and getting that right is very difficult.
Good, thank you.